Alien Diplomat thought she was untouchable until a human put her in her place. Ambassador Leora Vexarin glided through the bustling corridors of Nexus Station with the practiced ease of someone who knew precisely how much space she deserved. Her emerald skin caught the artificial light, creating an almost luminous effect that drew eyes from every species she passed. Not that she needed the extra attention. Her position as the Thalassian Confederation's senior diplomat already guaranteed that. Ambassador, your meeting with the Centaurian delegation has been pushed back by 30 minutes. Her aide, a timid, blue-skinned proximate named Meryl, informed her while struggling to keep pace. Leora didn't slow her stride. Unacceptable. Inform them that I will be there at the originally scheduled time, or they can explain to their prime minister why the trade agreement remains unsigned for another fiscal quarter. But they specifically requested... Did I stutter, Meryl? Leora stopped abruptly, causing her aide to nearly collide with her back. She turned, golden eyes narrowing. The Centaurians have been playing these little power games for weeks. I don't have time for their posturing. Several passers-by slowed to observe the exchange, which only fueled Leora's irritation. She despised being a spectacle, unless she was orchestrating it herself. Of course, Ambassador, I'll relay your message immediately. Meryl's antennae drooped as he tapped frantically on his datapad. Leora resumed her walk toward the diplomatic wing, mentally reviewing her schedule. The Nexus Station, humanity's crowning achievement in interstellar diplomacy, had become the galaxy's premier neutral ground for negotiations since Earth had unexpectedly emerged as a stabilizing force in interspecies relations. Not that she'd ever admit that aloud. Humans were useful, certainly. Adaptable, surprisingly resilient, and occasionally clever. But their rapid ascension from planetary confinement to galactic players in less than a century had been more luck than skill, in her estimation. The Thalassian Confederation had been navigating the complex web of interstellar politics for millennia before humans had even discovered electricity. As she approached the security checkpoint leading to the diplomatic quarter, she noted with annoyance that the line was longer than usual. Some sort of scanning issue in Yari, apparently. Ambassador Vexarin, called a gruff voice from the security booth. Please proceed to priority screening. Leora smiled thinly. At least someone on this station understood protocol. She glided past the waiting line, ignoring the grumbles from those she bypassed. The security officer, a stocky Arcturian with too many eyes, waved her through. Thank you for your patience, Ambassador. We're experiencing some technical difficulties with our primary scanners. Perhaps you should consider upgrading your systems more frequently, she suggested with just enough sweetness to make the criticism sting. The Thalassian embassy replaced ours last month. I'd be happy to provide a recommendation. The Arcturian's multiple eyes blinked in unison. I'll pass that along to station management. Leora nodded and continued through, satisfied with having made her point. The diplomatic quarter was noticeably quieter than the public areas of the station, its curved corridors lined with the offices and residences of various ambassadors and their staff. She was halfway to her office when her communicator chimed. Ambassador, there's a situation in Conference Room Delta that requires your attention. Meryl's voice came through, sounding even more nervous than usual. Leora sighed. What kind of situation? The Rigelian trade minister is threatening to withdraw from the multi-species commerce treaty. He's claiming the human representative insulted their ancestral trading practices. Of course he is, Leora muttered. The Rigelians were notoriously sensitive about their bartering customs, which most species found archaic and inefficient. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Tell them not to say another word until I arrive. She altered course toward Conference Room Delta, mentally preparing her approach. This was precisely why the station needed experienced diplomats like herself. Humans, for all their supposed charm, lacked the finesse required for delicate interspecies negotiations. As she rounded the corner near the conference rooms, she nearly collided with a human male in a security uniform. He stepped aside at the last moment, but not before Leora felt his arm brush against hers. "Excuse me," he said, his deep voice carrying no trace of the deference she expected. Leora stopped, affronted by both the physical contact and his tone. She turned to face him fully, taking in his appearance with a critical eye. He was tall for a human, with a solid build that filled out his uniform impressively. Short blonde hair, cropped in the military style common among human security personnel. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. A cold gray blue that regarded her with neither intimidation nor admiration. "You should watch where you're going," she said sharply. "And it's ambassador to you, not excuse me." The human's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those icy eyes. "My apologies, Ambassador. Security Chief Callahan at your service." He offered a small, perfunctory bow that somehow managed to seem more mocking than respectful. Leora's eyes narrowed. "Security Chief?" "I wasn't aware there had been a change in leadership." "Recent promotion," he replied simply. "I've been reviewing the station's security protocols. There are improvements to be made." "I'm sure there are," she said dismissively. "Perhaps you could start by teaching your staff proper diplomatic etiquette. The checkpoint officers barely acknowledged my status." Callahan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My officers are trained to treat all station residents with equal respect, Ambassador, regardless of their status." The emphasis he placed on the final word was subtle but unmistakable. Leora felt a flash of genuine anger. Who did this human think he was? "Equal respect?" she repeated, her voice dangerously soft. "Perhaps that approach works on your primitive homeworld, Chief Callahan, but here in civilized space, there's a hierarchy. One that has maintained peace among species far older than yours." A small crowd had begun to gather at a discreet distance, drawn by the tension between the ambassador and the security chief. Leora was vaguely aware of Merrill hovering anxiously at the edge of her peripheral vision. "Ambassador," Callahan said, his voice remaining steady, "with all due respect, that hierarchy you're so fond of nearly led to 3 interstellar wars in the past decade alone. So it was human diplomacy, equal treatment for all species, that prevented those conflicts." Leora laughed, the sound like crystal chimes but with an edge that could cut. "Human diplomacy? Is that what you call it? Your species stumbled onto the galactic stage barely a century ago, and you think you understand the complexities of interstellar relations better than civilizations that have been navigating them for millennia?" She stepped closer, her golden eyes flashing. "Let me educate you, Chief Callahan. Your species was allowed into the galactic community out of curiosity, not necessity. You're tolerated because you're amusing, like a child who occasionally says something clever by accident. But don't mistake tolerance for respect." The crowd had grown larger now, representatives from various species watching with a mixture of discomfort and fascination. Leora was dimly aware that she was creating exactly the kind of scene she normally despised. But something about this human's calm defiance had gotten under her skin. "Your primitive understanding of diplomacy, treating everyone as equals regardless of their evolutionary development or cultural achievements, is precisely why humans are still considered galactic newcomers despite your technological advancements," she continued, her voice rising. "You lack the sophistication to recognize that true peace comes from knowing one's place in the natural order." Callahan had remained silent during her tirade, his expression unreadable. When she finally paused for breath, he spoke quietly, but with a firmness that carried through the now silent corridor. "Are you finished, Ambassador?" The simple question, delivered without heat but with unmistakable authority, caught Leora off guard. Before she could respond, he continued, "Because while you've been educating me on the natural order of things, the Rigelian Trade Minister has walked out of your conference room, and the Centaurian delegation has filed a formal complaint about your refusal to accommodate their schedule." Leora felt her face flush a deeper shade of green. "How dare you—" But Callahan wasn't finished. In one smooth motion, he stepped forward and, with a gentle but firm grip, took hold of her chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze directly. "Enough," he said, his voice dropping to a deep, commanding tone that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Shut up and stop causing trouble. You're not as untouchable as you think." The corridor went deathly silent. For perhaps the first time in her diplomatic career, Leora Vexarine found herself completely speechless. The shock of being physically handled was eclipsed only by the strange electric sensation that shot through her at his touch. Callahan released her just as quickly as he'd grasped her, stepping back with a professional nod. "Now, if you'll excuse me, Ambassador, I have a station to secure. Perhaps you might want to salvage what's left of your negotiations." He turned and walked away, the crowd parting before him like water around a stone. Leora stood frozen, a storm of conflicting emotions, outrage, humiliation, and something else entirely swirling within her. "Ambassador?" Meryl's tentative voice broke through her stupor. "The Rigelians. They're threatening to leave the station entirely." Leora blinked, forcing herself back to the present moment. "Yes," she said, her voice not quite steady. "Of course, take me to them immediately." As she followed her aide toward the conference room, she found her thoughts returning to the human security chief's audacious action. No one had ever dared to touch her without permission, let alone command her silence. She should be filing a formal complaint, demanding his immediate removal from the station. Instead, she found herself replaying the moment his fingers had grasped her chin, the intensity in those cold blue eyes as they locked with hers. The memory sent another involuntary shiver through her body. This wasn't over, she decided, not by a long shot. Security Chief Callahan would learn that crossing Ambassador Leora Vexarin was the biggest mistake of his short human career. Yet even as she plotted his professional demise, she couldn't quite ignore the small voice in the back of her mind that whispered a troubling truth. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. 3 days after the corridor incident, Leora sat in her private office, fingers drumming against the polished surface of her desk. The formal complaint against Security Chief Callahan lay before her, awaiting her final approval before submission to the station director. She'd spent hours crafting the document, detailing every aspect of his unprofessional conduct and physical intimidation of a diplomatic representative. The language was precise, the accusations damning. By all rights, the human should be removed from his position by the end of the week. So why hadn't she submitted it yet? Leora pushed away from her desk with a frustrated sigh, moving to the panoramic window that offered a spectacular view of the swirling nebula outside the station. The cosmic gases glowed in shades of purple and blue, not unlike the bruise her pride had suffered. "Ambassador," Meryl's voice came through the intercom. "The Arcturian delegation has arrived for your meeting." "Send them in," she replied, straightening her formal diplomatic robes, an elegant creation of flowing emerald fabric that complemented her skin tone perfectly. As she greeted the Arcturians with practiced charm, Leora found her thoughts drifting back to Callahan. Since their confrontation, she'd made discreet inquiries about the human. What she'd discovered was both irritating and intriguing. David Callahan had not been promoted through the typical bureaucratic channels. He'd been personally appointed by Admiral Harrison, the human who oversaw Nexus Station's security operations. More surprisingly, Callahan's service record was partially classified, unusual for a station security position. The meeting with the Arcturians proceeded smoothly, but Leora was operating on diplomatic autopilot, her mind occupied with strategies for dealing with the infuriating human. By the time the delegation departed, she had made her decision. "Meryl," she called as her aide entered to clear away the meeting refreshments. "I need you to arrange a meeting with Director Curry as soon as possible." "Of course, Ambassador. May I ask what this concerns?" "Security matters," she replied vaguely. "And Meryl?" "This stays between us." The blue-skinned aide nodded, his antennae twitching with curiosity, but knowing better than to press further. Once alone, Leora returned to the complaint on her desk. With a decisive gesture, she transferred it to a secure folder rather than sending it. Direct confrontation had its place, but in this instance, a more subtle approach might yield better results. Director Curry, a distinguished human female who had served as Nexus Station's civilian administrator for nearly a decade, had always respected Leora's diplomatic acumen. A private word about concerns regarding the new security chief would carry significant weight. Ambassador Vexarin, always a pleasure, Director Curry greeted her warmly the following morning. The director's office was a tasteful blend of human and alien aesthetics, reflecting her commitment to interspecies cooperation. "Director, thank you for making time in your schedule," Leora replied, taking the offered seat across from Curry's desk. "Your message mentions security concerns?" The director's expression grew serious. Has there been an incident I should be aware of? Leora carefully arranged her features into a mask of professional concern. Not an incident, precisely, more a matter of protocol. I've had a somewhat troubling interaction with your new security chief. She proceeded to describe the corridor confrontation, artfully emphasizing Callahan's physical intimidation while downplaying her own provocative comments. As she spoke, she watched Curie's expression, expecting to see growing concern. Instead, the director's face remained frustratingly neutral. I see, Curie said when Leora had finished. And you feel this warrants official action? At minimum, I believe Chief Callahan would benefit from additional training in diplomatic protocols, Leora suggested smoothly. Perhaps a temporary reassignment while he develops a better understanding of interspecies etiquette? Director Curie leaned back in her chair, studying Leora with an intensity that made the ambassador slightly uncomfortable. Ambassador Vexarin, I've always valued your candor, so allow me to be equally frank, Curie said finally. Chief Callahan was brought to Nexus Station specifically because of his unique qualifications in handling high-tension diplomatic situations. Leora blinked in surprise. I find that difficult to believe given his behavior. Before accepting this position, Callahan served as security liaison to the Proxima Centauri peace negotiations. He personally prevented an assassination attempt that would have derailed the entire process. Curie's tone was matter-of-fact. His methods may sometimes appear unconventional, but they're effective. Effective? Leora couldn't keep the incredulity from her voice. He physically handled a diplomatic representative. After, by your own admission, you publicly denigrated his species and created a scene that was disrupting ongoing negotiations, Curie countered gently. Ambassador, I respect your position and your accomplishments, but I cannot remove or reassign an officer for doing precisely what he was hired to do, maintaining order in potentially volatile situations. Leora felt her face flush with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. This was not how she had expected the conversation to proceed. I see, she said stiffly. So humans are permitted to manhandle ambassadors as long as they claim it's for security purposes. Director Curie sighed. That's not what I said, and you know it. If you wish to file a formal complaint, that is certainly your right. It will be investigated thoroughly, as all such complaints are. The implication was clear. A formal investigation would include a complete review of Leora's own behavior leading up to the incident. That won't be necessary, Leora said after a moment. I simply wanted to bring the matter to your attention. And I appreciate that, Curie replied, her tone warming slightly. For what it's worth, I've worked with David, Chief Callahan, on previous assignments. He's direct, certainly, but he's also fair and exceptionally good at his job. Leora nodded stiffly, already planning her next move. If the direct approach wouldn't work, she would need to be more creative. As she rose to leave, Director Curie added, Oh, an ambassador? The annual Nexus Gala is next week. As our most senior diplomatic representative, your presence would be greatly appreciated. Chief Callahan will be coordinating security for the event. Perhaps it would be an opportunity to establish a more productive working relationship. The suggestion was delivered casually, but Leora recognized it for what it was, a diplomatic nudge to resolve the tension before it affected the station operations. Of course, she replied smoothly. I wouldn't miss it. The Nexus Gala was the station's premier social event, bringing together diplomatic representatives, high-ranking officers, and distinguished visitors in a celebration of interspecies cooperation. Held in the station's Grand Observation Dome, with the nebula providing a spectacular backdrop, it was an opportunity for informal networking that often accomplished more than weeks of formal negotiations. Leora had spent considerable time selecting her attire for the evening, a flowing gown in deep midnight blue that contrasted beautifully with her emerald skin. The fabric was embedded with microscopic luminescent particles that mimicked the star field visible through the dome, creating the illusion that she carried a piece of the cosmos with her. As she entered the observation dome, she was aware of the appreciative glances from representatives of various species. The Thalassian form was considered aesthetically pleasing by most humanoid standards, and Leora knew she was an exceptional example even among her own kind. She accepted a glass of Centaurian sparkling wine from a passing server and began making her way through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with colleagues and subtly gathering information. All the while, she kept an eye out for a certain blonde-haired human. She spotted him eventually standing near one of the security checkpoints, engaged in conversation with a Rigelian trade minister. Callahan was dressed in formal security attire, a crisp black uniform with silver accents that emphasized his broad shoulders and athletic build. Leora was irritated to find herself noticing how well the uniform suited him. As if sensing her gaze, Callahan looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the room. For a moment, neither looked away. Then he nodded, a slight acknowledgement of her presence before returning his attention to the Rigelian. The exchange lasted mere seconds, but it left Leora feeling strangely unsettled. She had expected hostility or perhaps wariness after their confrontation and her meeting with Director Curry. Instead, he had regarded her with the same cool professionalism he might show any other guest. It was disappointing somehow. Shaking off the feeling, Leora immersed herself in the diplomatic mingling that was her specialty. She charmed the Arcturian ambassador, smoothed over a misunderstanding between the Proximan and Centaurian delegations, and even managed to secure a tentative agreement from the notoriously difficult Rigelian trade minister. It was nearly 2 hours later when she found herself momentarily alone, having stepped away from the main gathering to enjoy the nebula view in relative peace. "Impressive work with the Rigelian?" came a deep voice from behind her. "He's been stonewalling negotiations for weeks." Leora turned to find Callahan standing a respectful distance away, his hands clasped behind his back in a formal posture. "Chief Callahan," she acknowledged coolly, "I'm surprised you noticed. I thought you'd be too busy maintaining order." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Part of maintaining order is knowing what's happening on my station, including diplomatic breakthroughs." "Your station?" Leora raised an eyebrow. "That's a rather presumptuous claim for someone so new to his position." "Force of habit," he replied, unperturbed by her barb. "When you're responsible for the safety of everyone aboard, you tend to think of it that way." Leora studied him, trying to reconcile this calm, articulate man with the one who had grasped her chin and ordered her to be quiet days earlier. "I understand you spoke with Director Curry about our encounter," he continued, his tone neutral. "I did," she confirmed, lifting her chin slightly. "I found your behavior inappropriate." "And I found yours provocative and disruptive," he countered, though without heat. "But I could have handled it differently." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was more concession than she had expected. "Yes, you could have," she agreed. After a moment's hesitation, she added, "As could I, perhaps." The admission cost her some pride, but Leora was pragmatic enough to recognize when a strategic concession was necessary. Callahan nodded, accepting her words without pressing for more. They stood in silence for a moment, both gazing out at the nebula. "It's quite something, isn't it?" he said finally, nodding toward the cosmic display. "No matter how many times I see it, it never gets old." "One of the few things humans and Thalassians might agree on," Leora replied, surprised to find herself engaging in casual conversation with him, "though I imagine our species perceive the colors somewhat differently." "How so?" he asked, seeming genuinely interested. "Thalassian vision extends further into the ultraviolet spectrum than human vision," she explained. "What you see is primarily purple and blue. I see with additional hues that have no name in your language." "That sounds beautiful," Callahan said thoughtfully, "and a little sad that we can't share that perception." The comment caught Leora off guard. It was unexpectedly poetic coming from the stern security chief. "There are translation programs that attempt to simulate the difference," she found herself saying. "They're not perfect, but they give a reasonable approximation." "I'd like to see that sometime," he replied, his gaze shifting from the nebula to her face. Leora felt a sudden warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature in the observation dome. The intensity in his gray-blue eyes reminded her of their confrontation, but without the anger, just that same direct focus that seemed to see through her diplomatic facade. Before she could respond, his communication device chimed softly. He checked it with a frown. "Duty call," he said, straightening. "Enjoy the rest of the gala, Ambassador." As he walked away, Leora found herself watching his retreating form with a mixture of confusion and something else she wasn't quite ready to name. This encounter had not gone according to plan. She had intended to be cold, perhaps even provocative, testing his restraint and gathering ammunition for future maneuvers. Instead, Anna, she had engaged in one of the more genuine conversations she'd had since arriving on the station. Most disturbing of all, she had enjoyed it. The day after the gala, Leora received a notification that made her blood boil. Security Chief Callahan had implemented new protocols for the diplomatic quarter, including random security sweeps and additional checkpoints during high-traffic periods. The message was politely worded, citing increased threats to diplomatic personnel throughout the sector, but Leora saw it for what it was, a power play. After their almost civil conversation at the gala, the human was now asserting his authority over her domain. "Meryl," she called sharply, "arrange a meeting with the Diplomatic Council immediately, and get me everything you can find on Chief Callahan's service record, especially any incidents or disciplinary actions." "Yes, Ambassador," Meryl replied, looking slightly alarmed at her tone. "Though I should mention that most of his record is classified." "Then find someone who can unclassify it," she snapped. "I want to know exactly who I'm dealing with." As Meryl hurried away, Leora paced her office, her mind racing. The human had been cordial last night, almost charming in his directness. Had that all been a ploy to lower her guard before implementing these intrusive new measures? By the time the Diplomatic Council convened that afternoon, a gathering of the 12 most senior ambassadors on the station, Leora had worked herself into a righteous fury. She presented her case eloquently, emphasizing the disruption to diplomatic functions and the implied insult to their collective status. To her satisfaction, most of the council seemed to share her outrage. The Arcturian ambassador was particularly vocal, his multiple eyes blinking rapidly in agitation as he described the inconvenience of the morning security sweep. "This is clearly an overreach by the security department," Leora concluded. "I propose we submit a formal protest to Director Corey, demanding the immediate rescinding of these protocols and a review of Chief Callahan's suitability for his position." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the council chamber, until the doors slid open to admit an unexpected visitor. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Security Chief Callahan said as he strode into the room, followed by a grim-faced Director Corey. "This is a closed council session," Leora said icily. "You were not invited, Chief Callahan." "No, but I was," Director Corey interjected. "As station director, I have standing access to all council meetings, and given the topic of discussion, I thought it prudent to bring Chief Callahan along." Leora felt a flicker of unease. She had intended to present their unified protest to Corey later, after the council had agreed on their approach. Being confronted directly was not part of the plan. "Director, we were just discussing the new security protocols," the Arcturian ambassador said, recovering quickly. "We find them unnecessarily intrusive and disruptive to our diplomatic functions." "I understand your concerns," Corey replied diplomatically. "However, I believe you may be missing some context. Chief Callahan." Callahan stepped forward, his expression serious. "3 days ago, we intercepted communications indicating a credible threat against the diplomatic quarter. A terrorist group known as the Purity Front has been targeting interspecies cooperation efforts throughout the sector." He activated a holographic display in the center of the council table, showing images of destruction at what appeared to be another space station. "This was Outpost Gamma 9 last month. 17 diplomats were killed, including the entire Proximan delegation." His eyes met Leora's briefly. The attackers specifically targeted ambassadors from species known for their interspecies relations programs. The council chamber fell silent as the implication sank in. The Thalassian Confederation was famous for its progressive approach to interspecies relations. Leora herself had pioneered several controversial integration initiatives. "Why weren't we informed of this threat?" she demanded, though with less heat than before. "Because until this morning, we weren't certain Nexus Station was a target," Director Corey explained. "The new security protocols weren't announced until we had confirmation." "And you didn't think to consult with us before implementing them?" Leora pressed, unwilling to concede so easily. "Security operations sometimes require immediate action," Callahan replied, his tone professional but firm. "Consultation takes time we don't always have." "What Chief Callahan is trying to say," Director Corey interjected smoothly, "is that while we value diplomatic input, the safety of station personnel must be our primary concern. That said, we're certainly open to suggestions for minimizing disruption while maintaining necessary security measures." It was a masterful diplomatic maneuver, acknowledging their concerns while making it clear the security protocols would remain in place. Leora recognized when she was outmaneuvered. Perhaps we could establish a liaison committee, she suggested, shifting to damage control. Representatives from the Diplomatic Council could work directly with security to ensure both our needs are met. An excellent suggestion, Ambassador Vexarin, Curie agreed readily. Would you be willing to chair such a committee? Leora hesitated, sensing a trap but unable to see a graceful way to refuse. Of course, she said finally, in the interest of station harmony. Excellent. You can coordinate directly with Chief Callahan. The director's smile was just a touch too satisfied. I believe you two have already established a working relationship. As the meeting concluded, Leora found herself standing face-to-face with Callahan once more. The other council members filed out, leaving them momentarily alone. Well played, Chief, she said quietly. Using a security threat to expand your authority. The threat is real, Ambassador, he replied, his expression hardening. I don't play games with people's lives. And I don't appreciate being manipulated into working with you, she shot back. Is that what you think this is? He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Manipulation? Leora refused to back away, tilting her head to maintain eye contact. What would you call it? I'd call it making the best of a difficult situation, he said, his voice dropping to a lower register that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. We both have jobs to do, Ambassador. Yeah, mine is keeping you safe, whether you like it or not. There was something in his tone, a possessive edge that should have offended her diplomatic sensibilities, but instead triggered a flutter of something primal in her core. I don't need your protection, she insisted, though the words lacked conviction, even to her own ears. Everyone needs protection sometime, he countered softly, even untouchable ambassadors. The reference to their first encounter hung in the air between them, charged with unspoken tension. For a wild moment, Leora thought he might reach for her again, his fingers finding her chin as they had before. Instead, he stepped back, professional mask firmly in place once more. My office, tomorrow at 0900, will discuss the liaison committee's parameters. With that, he turned and left, leaving Leora to wonder why she felt so strangely disappointed. Later that evening, Leora sat in her private quarters, reviewing the information Merrill had managed to gather on Callahan. It wasn't much. Most of his service record remained frustratingly classified, but there were enough pieces to form a partial picture. David Callahan had served in Earth's unified military forces before transitioning to diplomatic security. He'd been involved in several high-profile protection details, including the Proxima Centauri peace negotiation Koyuri had mentioned. There was a commendation for extraordinary courage under fire during an incident at the Rigelian embassy on Earth, though the details were redacted. Most interestingly, there was a brief note about his personal life. He had been engaged to another security officer who had died during a terrorist attack on a civilian transport 3 years ago. Since then, his assignments had increasingly focused on counterterrorism operations. Leora found herself staring at his official portrait, the stern expression, those penetrating gray-blue eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed facades. There was something compelling about him, a directness that both irritated and intrigued her. She closed the file with a frustrated sigh. This power struggle had become more complicated than she'd anticipated. Callahan had powerful allies, a legitimate security concern to justify his actions, and now, thanks to Director Curie's maneuvering, a mandate to work directly with her. Yet as she prepared for bed, Leora found her thoughts drifting not to strategies for regaining the upper hand, but to the moment in the council chamber when he'd stepped close to her, the intensity in his eyes, the deep timbre of his voice when he'd said he would protect her, whether she liked it or not. And the most troubling realization of all, part of her had wanted him to touch her again, to feel those strong fingers tilting her face toward his. This is ridiculous, she muttered to herself, slipping beneath the silken covers of her bed. He's just a human, an irritating, presumptuous human. But as sleep claimed her, her dreams were filled with gray-blue eyes and a voice that commanded her to be quiet in ways that left her breathless and wanting. The security alert blared through Nexus Station at 0600 hours, interrupting Leora's morning preparations. Security breach in Diplomatic Quarter, Section 14A. All personnel implement evacuation protocols. Leora abandoned her morning ritual and rushed to her communication terminal. Before she could make contact with her staff, her private channel chimed. "Ambassador," Callahan's voice came through, tense but controlled. "We've detected a suspicious package near the Thalassian embassy. I need your assistance with the diplomatic evacuation." "I'll be there in 5 minutes," she replied, already changing into more practical attire. When she arrived at the diplomatic quarter, controlled chaos reigned. Security personnel directed diplomats toward evacuation routes, while containment specialists converged on Section 14A. "Ambassador Vexarin," the Arcturian ambassador approached, multiple eyes blinking rapidly in distress. "These security officers insist we leave without our ceremonial artifacts." "Ambassador Thorix," Leora responded smoothly, "a security threat has been identified. I'm personally overseeing the protection of all diplomatic artifacts. You have my word, they will be secured." The Arcturian hesitated, then nodded. "Your word is sufficient, Ambassador." Similar scenes played out as Leora moved through the evacuation zone, smoothing ruffled diplomatic feathers. Through it all, she maintained communication with Callahan, who was coordinating the containment team's approach. "The Rigelian ambassador refuses to leave his quarters," she reported. "Cultural prohibition against fleeing from an unseen threat." "Can you convince him?" Callahan's voice came through, tense but controlled. "Not quickly enough, but there's a protocol exception. If a higher status individual physically retrieves him, it's considered an honor escort rather than a retreat." "On my way," Callahan responded immediately. For the next hour, Leora worked seamlessly with the security team, her diplomatic expertise complementing their tactical approach. When the all-clear finally came, the package had been a sophisticated decoy designed to test station response. She found herself standing beside Callahan in the security command center, reviewing the operation. "Your assistance was invaluable, Ambassador," he said, genuine respect in his tone. "Your knowledge of diplomatic protocols prevented several potential incidents." "Your team responded efficiently," she acknowledged, surprised to find herself genuinely impressed. "The evacuation was completed in 17 minutes. "That's remarkable." They stood side by side reviewing security footage, their earlier antagonism temporarily set aside. Leora was acutely aware of his presence, the controlled energy in his posture, the faint scent of something distinctly human, yet not unpleasant. "The decoy was sophisticated," Callahan noted, "designed to appear legitimate under initial scans. This wasn't random. Someone wanted to observe our response procedures." "The Purity Front?" Leora asked, recalling the terrorist group he'd mentioned in the council meeting. "Possibly." His jaw tightened. "Which means they're already on the station, gathering intelligence for a potential attack." The Harmony Convergence ceremony transformed the Thalassian embassy's grand reception hall with floating, luminescent spheres and crystalline structures that refracted light in mesmerizing patterns. Leora, dressed in ceremonial robes of shimmering silver and green, greeted each diplomatic representative personally. She spotted Callahan entering the hall wearing a formal security uniform that emphasized his broad shoulders and athletic build. When she approached him to perform the welcome ritual, her pulse quickened traitorously. "Chief Callahan," she greeted formally. "Welcome to the Harmony Convergence. As host, I offer you peace and clarity of purpose." She extended her hands palms up in the traditional gesture. After a moment's hesitation, Callahan placed his hands atop hers, his touch warm and firm. "The ritual requires that I read your intentions," she explained softly. "It's a diplomatic formality, but it has certain sensory aspects." "I understand," he replied, his voice equally low. "Proceed, Ambassador." Leora closed her eyes, focusing on the point where their hands connected. Thalassians possessed limited empathic sensitivity, not mind reading, but an ability to sense emotional states through physical contact. As she opened her empathic senses to Callahan, she was immediately struck by the intensity of his emotional presence. Most humans projected chaotic surface emotions, but Callahan's were remarkably focused. Determination, vigilance, and beneath those, a deep current of something more complex. Without conscious intention, she delved deeper, drawn by that underlying current. What she found caught her completely off guard. Desire, sharp and clear, directed at her. Not just physical attraction, but a more nuanced appreciation tinged with respect and fascination. Her eyes flew open in surprise, meeting his steady gaze. He knew what she had sensed. She could see it in the slight tightening of his jaw, the faint darkening of his eyes. "Your intentions are clear," she said, the ritual words suddenly heavy with double meaning. "You are welcomed among us." She should have released his hands then, moving on to the next guest. Instead, they remained connected a moment longer than protocol dictated, the contact charged with unspoken awareness. Later, as the ceremony transitioned to the reception phase, Leora found herself gravitating toward Callahan despite her best intentions. He stood near one of the crystalline structures, engaged in conversation with the Rigelian ambassador. "Ambassador Vex Aaron," the Rigelian greeted her warmly. "I was just expressing my appreciation to Chief Callahan for his culturally sensitive approach during the recent security incident." After the Rigelian moved on, Leora and Callahan found themselves momentarily alone in a quiet corner of the reception hall. "During the welcome ritual," she said suddenly, "I sensed something unexpected." Callahan turned to face her fully, his expression carefully neutral. "The empathic aspect of Thalassian diplomacy. I've read about it." "Then you know what I sensed," she said, holding his gaze. "I can guess," he replied, his voice dropping to a register that sent a shiver along her spine. "The question is, what do you intend to do with that knowledge?" Before she could respond, his communication device chimed. "Security alert." Nothing urgent, but he needed to check in with the command center. "This conversation isn't over, Ambassador," he said quietly as he departed. "Just postpone." The intelligence briefing the following morning confirmed their fears. The Purity Front was targeting Nexus Station, with specific focus on the diplomatic quarter. "Ambassador Vex Aaron," Director Khoury said gravely, "the Thalassian embassy appears to be a primary objective. Your work on interspecies cooperation has made you a priority target. We need to implement additional security measures," Khoury decided. "Ambassador, until this threat is neutralized, you'll be assigned personal security detail." "That's unnecessary," Leora protested. "I have embassy security." "Embassy security isn't equipped for this level of threat," Callahan interjected firmly. "This group has successfully infiltrated multiple secure facilities." "Chief Callahan is right," Khoury said, "and given the sensitive nature of your work, I'm assigning him personally to coordinate your security." "Very well," Leora conceded with as much dignity as she could muster. "I'll cooperate with whatever security measures Chief Callahan deems necessary." "Excellent," Khoury said, rising. "I'll leave you two to work out the details." As the briefing room emptied, Leora found herself alone with Callahan once more. "So," she said, breaking the silence, "you're to be my personal bodyguard." "Not exactly. I'll be coordinating your security team and implementing protocols specific to your protection." He paused. "However, I will be personally overseeing security during high-profile diplomatic functions, and I'll need to conduct a thorough assessment of your private quarters." The thought of Callahan in her personal space sent an unexpected thrill through her. "Is that really necessary?" "Yes," he said simply. "Your safety is non-negotiable, Ambassador." "When would you like to conduct this assessment?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "This evening, if your schedule permits. The sooner we implement full security protocols, the better. My last meeting ends at 1900 hours. After that, I'm at your disposal, Chief." Something flickered in his eyes at her choice of words. 1930 hours, then. I'll meet you at your quarters." At precisely 1930 hours, Leora's door chimed. She had changed into more casual attire, a flowing tunic of deep blue over fitted trousers. It was not, she told herself firmly, selected with Callahan's arrival in mind. "Ambassador," he greeted her. "Thank you for accommodating this assessment on short notice." "Of course," she replied, stepping aside to allow him entry. "The safety of the diplomatic corps is paramount." For 40 minutes, she attempted to focus on diplomatic correspondence while acutely aware of Callahan moving methodically through her quarters. When he entered her study, she looked up with carefully composed features. "How is the assessment progressing?" she asked, her tone professionally neutral. "Your quarters have good baseline security," he replied, "but there are several vulnerabilities that need addressing. The window in the main living area. The transparency controls could be overridden from outside. She followed him back to the living area, where he began adjusting settings on the environmental control panel. As he worked, Leora found herself studying his profile. The focused concentration in his eyes, the strong line of his jaw, the capable hands moving confidently across the control panel. "You're very good at this," she observed. "Most security chiefs I've known were more administrators than field operatives." "I prefer hands-on work," he replied without looking up. "Keeps my skills sharp." "And what other skills do you maintain, Chief Callahan?" The question came out more provocatively than she had intended. This time he did look up, his eyes meeting hers with that direct intensity that seemed to see right through her diplomatic facades. "Many," he said simply, but the word carried weight. A charged silence fell between them, broken only by the soft hum of the station's environmental systems. "At the Harmony Convergence," she said suddenly, "you said our conversation was postponed, not over." Callahan straightened, turning to face her fully. "I did." "Perhaps we should continue it now," she suggested, her heart beating faster despite her outward composure. He studied her for a long moment. "Are you sure that's wise, Ambassador?" "Probably not," she admitted with a small smile. "But wisdom has never been as interesting as exploration." Something shifted in his eyes. A decision made, restraint carefully set aside. "What you sensed during the ritual was not a momentary impulse. It's been there since our first encounter." "When you put me in my place," she asked, a hint of challenge in her tone. "When I saw beyond the diplomatic facade to the woman beneath it," he corrected. "Brilliant, fierce, and far too accustomed to hiding behind protocol." He took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, but not yet touching. "You've been untouchable for so long," he continued, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her. "Not just physically, but emotionally. Hiding behind diplomatic immunity, behind cultural differences, behind your position." "And you think you've changed that?" she challenged, though her voice lacked conviction. "I think," he said, reaching up to trace the line of her jaw with gentle fingers, "you're tired of being untouchable." The simple touch sent electricity coursing through her. Leora had experienced attraction before, but this visceral response to a mere touch was something entirely new. "Perhaps," she conceded, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what makes you think you're the one who should touch me?" His lips curved in a slight smile. "Because I'm not intimidated by who you are. I see you, Leora, not just the ambassador, but the woman." The use of her given name, without title or formality, felt startlingly intimate. "And what woman do you see, David?" she asked, deliberately returning the intimacy. His hand moved from her jaw to cup the back of her neck, fingers threading through her silky green hair. Someone extraordinary, powerful, passionate beneath the diplomatic restraint. "And if you're wrong," she challenged, even as she leaned almost imperceptibly into his touch. "I'm not," he said with that infuriating confidence. "But if I am, tell me to stop." He leaned closer, his intention clear. Leora had a heartbeat to decide, to step back, to maintain the professional boundary, to remain the untouchable ambassador. Instead, she closed the distance herself, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that started as a challenge and quickly transformed into something far more consuming. 3 months later, the observation dome of Nexus Station glittered with starlight as diplomats gathered to celebrate the new Galactic Cooperation Accord. At the center stood Ambassador Leora Vexarin, her emerald features composed in the serene expression that had become her diplomatic signature. "The journey to this moment has not been without challenges," she addressed the assembled dignitaries. 3 months ago, those who feared interspecies cooperation attempted to destroy the foundation of our diplomatic work. And they failed not because of any single species' strength, but because we stood together. Her golden eyes swept the crowd, lingering on the tall human figure at the perimeter. Security Chief David Callahan maintained his professional vigilance, but the slight smile that touched his lips was meant for her alone. The Purity Front's attack had been thwarted through their combined efforts. Her diplomatic acumen and his security expertise creating a partnership that had saved countless lives. In the process, they had discovered something neither had expected, a connection that transcended professional boundaries and cultural differences. Later, as the celebration continued, Leora joined Callahan near one of the panoramic windows overlooking the nebula. "Impressive speech," he commented, standing close enough that their arms brushed lightly. "I had a particularly illuminating education in that principle," she replied with a smile that was for him alone. "From a humble security chief? I find that hard to believe." "There was nothing humble about the way you put me in my place that first day," she countered, her tone warm with affection. "You shattered every assumption I had about humans, and about myself." "You weren't exactly what I expected either," he admitted. "I thought you were just another arrogant diplomat who needed a reality check." "That I would become touchable," she suggested, deliberately brushing her fingers against his. "That you would become essential," he corrected softly. As they stood together watching the nebula's swirling colors, Leora reflected on how far she had come from the untouchable ambassador who had ruled Nexus Station with arrogant certainty. The human who had dared to challenge her had not only put her in her place, he had shown her a new place altogether, one where vulnerability was not weakness, but strength, where being touchable meant being truly alive. And for the first time in her long diplomatic career, Ambassador Leora Vaxarin was precisely where she wanted to be.